and this is what you wrote, he's been dreaming of mobilizing the military against protesters in the United States for years. And on Saturday night, he made it a reality. And just in the last hour or so, the breaking news has been coming in that he's ordering some 700 odd Marines. He's authorizing the deployment of those Marines to California, to Southern California, to respond, I suppose, in the next 24 hours to what's been taking place, when obviously that is not necessary at this point. He seems to be sort of laying the kindling for the fire that he would like to see started.
Yeah, and that's something he's talked about very explicitly in the past as well. When he's talked about mobilizing the National Guard, he's also on several occasions talked about calling up the military as well. And what's particularly concerning is that this kind of ups the danger level, really for both sides. Really for the you have to feel for the Marines who are being called up not of their own volition and are now being put in a situation that they're not trained for. These are people who are trained for lethal combat. And, I was just looking at the news, as I was waiting here to come on with you, and the Department of Defense hasn't even defined the terms of engagement for these the troops that are going to be arriving in Los Angeles. And as far as I know, they're on their way. So it's a very dangerous situation, all in sort of service of this kind of fantasy that Trump has been talking about at least since 2020, of using the National Guard, the military, as sort of his personal police force in order to bring law and order to the country, when of course that's precisely not what they're intended to do.
Yeah, and you were correct in pointing out the last time the National Guard was mobilized, absent a request from local officials, was in 1965 to protect civil rights protesters in Alabama marching from Selma to Montgomery. So in that case, the National Guard was being used to protect civil rights protesters. It seems Trump is trying to use the National Guard, use the Marines to suppress civil rights protesters. I suppose you could call them civil rights protesters, and that they are protesting on behalf of the civil rights of these migrants who have been swept up in these ICE raids. And this is despite the fact that the LAPD has described what they were describing the protests on Saturday as peaceful. Now, of course, you do see property damage. You do see occasionally things spiraling a bit here and there. Things get chippy, but it is not spiraled to the point where it seems like you would want to call in the National Guard at this point for specifically the reasons you're talking about.
Well, and really, I think, at the time that Trump finally made the call to bring in the National Guard, as far as reports were, that these protests had dwindled down to a few dozen people at a Home Depot outside of Los Angeles. But of course, when you call in the National Guard, which is an extraordinary step to do, particularly when it's not by request, when you're doing it when the local authorities are saying, we have the capacity to handle this with law enforcement. Obviously, federal law enforcement could be there as well. And you bring that in, that's going to inflame the situation. So I would expect that with the National Guard already being called in, with now the Marines, which is another escalation, that this situation escalates. And it seems that he's really relishing the escalation of this, and that this is not a issue with the call up, but it appears to be the point of all of this, is to escalate the situation and create this conflict with a blue state. There's plenty of undocumented immigrants working agricultural jobs in Florida, all throughout the South. We're not seeing that as the target. We're seeing it in California, and I don't think that's a coincidence.
Yeah, it's almost as though he is trying to create the crisis that he would like to respond to with military force, so he can cross this threshold and perhaps even invoke the Insurrectionist Act. And to me, the Insurrection Act, and to me, that is where the danger lies. And, I was talking to Michael Cohen about this earlier, and he's been around Trump for a long, long time, and he thinks all of this is sort of a giant distraction. That's his speculation, a giant distraction to get people off of Elon Musk and the big, beautiful bill and all of the failures he's been racking up. that may be the case, but that doesn't take away the fact that we may be in a situation where Trump escalates things to a point where perhaps the National Guard might be necessary. And then where do we go from here? We don't know.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I do think that this is something that he really admires about
Yeah.
authoritarians in other countries. I'm based in DC. You can see images of the tanks being brought in to DC for
Yeah.
this weekend. They're coming for Trump's birthday to do a military parade. So I don't think it's a coincidence that now Trump is now, he wants the military, which in American democracy, part of the whole thing is we don't have the military here.
Exactly.
You can go to other countries. I remember I was in Greece and you're around, where the prime minister was, and you can see the military kind of in their camouflage, patrolling through the woods. You don't see that in the United States, but now you do, and I think it's because he really admires that kind of show of force, and
Yeah.
so we can only hope that the situation in Los Angeles, and I think there's going to be situations, he's bringing them to Los Angeles. If this is how he wants to respond to protests, I imagine my inclination is that there's going to be protests in cities all around the country in
Yes.
response to this. And then what's going to happen? Is the military going to be deployed to every major city in the country? I
Right.
mean, this could really metastasize from here.
No, that's absolutely right. And the situation that I was thinking about over the weekend, because I covered it when I was at the White House during the first Trump administration, was the George Floyd protests that took place around June 1st of 2020, when they used federal forces to clear Lafayette Square in the area around it. They fired rubber bullets at people. They were using tear gas and chemical dispersants, basically to clear the park so Trump could have his photo op in front of St. John's Church. But you remember from that day, Judd, and I was there. I mean, you heard the tear gas canisters going off as he was speaking in the Rose Garden. I saw military vehicles with the National Guard rolling through the grounds of the White House. And then we saw General Mark Milley in his military fatigues. Remember that? It was on that day, and he expressed regret about that later on. And so Trump is, and of course, Mark Esper has made the disclosure that Trump was talking about, can we shoot the protesters and the like. This has been something that Trump has been fantasizing, I think is the word you used, about for some time. And the
Yeah.
thing that worries me is that he may be on the verge of seeing that play out. What he wanted to see around George Floyd, he wants to see it this time around, and maybe he'll get a chance to see it play out.
Yeah, and I think it's important, for the people listening as they're kind of consuming all the news. This is going to go. Who knows how long this will last?
Yeah.
That how we're defining what violence is in protests and what is a
Mm.
peaceful protest and what is not. Because one of the things that the protesters are doing in Los Angeles is they were on the road, which is obviously it's dangerous for those protesters. It's inconvenient for the people who are driving. But if you remember the civil rights protests in Selma, in the South, these were
Yes.
people, they were marching on the streets. They were
Right.
not, this was not something that was done so that everything could, protests are not done so that everything can sort of just work the exact way they were working before the protests were. It's designed to get attention. That
That's
does
the
not
point of it.
necessarily
Yeah.
mean they're violent, and it doesn't necessarily mean you need, less lethal or the Marines with machine guns to respond to them. We have a tradition of respecting, protests. It's one of the things I've learned living in DC for many, many years. And there's all sorts of folks who come around, some
Yeah.
of which, you may find abhorrent, some of which you may agree with, but they're, and most of them have a permit, but even the ones who don't, they're treated with respect. They are not threatened, at least in the best,
Exactly.
at least in the best of times. And so that's something I think we need to keep in mind that, valuing protest and having it as a something as a nation that we understand the importance of, whether or
Right.
not you agree with the protesters, is something that can cause inconvenience, and that doesn't necessarily justify the kind of escalation that we're seeing now.
Yeah, I mean, that's why they call it civil disobedience. And, the other thing in all of this is the way Trump flouts the law, flouts the Constitution, tries to test the bounds of where the law constrains the president in these types of situations. Trump is citing, this is according to Reuters, Trump citing Title 10 of the U.S. Code, a federal law that outlines the role of the U.S. Armed Forces in his June 7 order to call members of the National Guard into federal service. Um, Going on here, it says a provision of Title 10 allows the president to deploy National Guard units into federal service if the U.S. is invaded, there is a rebellion or danger of rebellion, or the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. We're not, and of course, the Posse Comitatus Act, 1878 law generally forbids the U.S. military from taking part in law enforcement. That includes the National Guard. And so we're not in a situation where we're in a rebellion or danger of a rebellion or any of those things. And so again, I guess we're waiting on a court to constrain him, and that's why California is suing, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although this is something that the courts are not well equipped to do.
Yeah.
Some in a democracy, in a lot of cases, it relies on the good faith of all of the parties. So courts are going to be, I don't know what's going to happen, and what Trump has done is quite extraordinary. So maybe the courts will do something extraordinary in return, in response. That's
Yeah.
possible, but courts are not in the habit of getting involved in an order from the president, the commander in chief, to any part of the military. I mean, that is something that they would stay as far away from as they could. And
That's
now
true.
Trump is putting them in that situation. So that's really it's a real stress test for the court, because also courts do not want to be in a situation where, what if they issue an order and say you have to turn the National Guard back over to the state of California, which is what they're
Right.
asking for in this lawsuit. What if Trump doesn't do that? Then what is the next step?
And what
And
do we
so
do?
that's the real quandary that we're facing. And I think the courts will think very, they'll think long and hard about that, because they don't want to be put in a position where they seem impotent to respond
Right.
to the situation, even if they believe the law is being violated.
And Trump could use the clock here in that the longer this drags out, the more likely it is that you will see some kind of clash that he could argue because it's out there in front of the cameras, it's on the Today Show, it's on the cable newscasts, and so on. He could say, "Aha, see, this is what I'm talking about here. This is why I need to do this." And
Exactly.
yeah, and that's
And I
what
think
concerns
and I
me.
think that's kind of invoking this more obscure statute, which, if you read the text of Trump's order, really only allows them not to be involved in any law enforcement, really deal with any of the people around it all, but just support the federal and state law enforcement folks that are there. But the
Yeah.
fact that he sent them, as you were just saying, and now the Marines, could inflame the situation so that then he has a stronger case that it is an insurrection. It was interesting. Yesterday, he was asked by the press, "Is this an insurrection?" He said no. He doesn't think it's gotten to that level yet, and then proceeded to post about a bunch of times and calling them insurrectionists. So he's a little confused as to what he wants to call this, but I think he would
Yeah.
like it. He would like to have full reign to do whatever he would like with the military in this.
It's almost as if Stephen Miller or somebody inside the White House said, "Well, if you don't call them insurrectionists, then we might not be able to use the Insurrection Act." And, it sort of has that calling card in the way he's sort of done a 180 and now started to talk about these protesters and calling them insurrection, which is just outrageous. But I think he knows he's poking and prodding and trying to set people off when he does that sort of thing. It's the same thing with this Truth Social post when he says, if they spit, we will hit. And of course, on January 6, 2021, at the Capitol, they were doing far worse to the police officers on that day. And he pardoned all of those people. So,
Yeah. And I think, just taking a step back, how we really got there, I started thinking about this when you talked about Stephen Miller, is,
yeah.
there was a pledge by Trump, by the administration, that they were going to deport millions of undocumented immigrants. Everyone was going to go out. And,
Yeah.
I think they started kind of with the low hanging fruit of people they could identify as having a criminal record or already in the system, trying to get them out, but they've really run up against a wall very quickly with those
Yes.
kind of folks, because the majority of people are undocumented, have been here for years, and are just working in places like Los Angeles, but many other places all around the country. And that's
Yeah.
really what has ignited this. Is they are desperate to get their deportation levels up. They haven't really significantly exceeded the levels of deportation under Biden, and they haven't come
Right.
close to the
That's right.
deportation levels under Obama. No one has
Yeah.
been more successful at deporting undocumented immigrants than Barack Obama.
I
And in
remember.
fact, yeah, so that was, and so
Yeah.
they are forced now to go into workplaces, which can be a more efficient way of doing it. Because if you do have a workplace, and there are industries that heavily rely on undocumented workers, certain industries, the garment industry
Yep.
in Los Angeles, but also agricultural industries in the South, other types of work, you might be able to get a large number of people all at one time. But when you're doing that, you are ripping people who have been part of those communities for years. And that is triggering the protest when people who they know, who they love, who they've had relationships with, professional relationships,
Yeah.
personal relationships for years and years and years, are getting rounded up, especially in a place like Los Angeles, in these communities where it's really a huge part of the community fabric. That's what created the protests.
Yeah, and I've been out to California lots of times. A lot of friends out there, and some of those friends are Latino, and they say, there's an expression out in California: "We didn't cross the border crossed us." And this gets to one of the issues that Stephen Miller and his cohorts, people like Tom Homan, are running up against. And I've been talking about this on my show repeatedly, and that is that one of the big lies of the 2024 campaign was when Trump and Stephen Miller and those types were out there saying in front of the cameras that they were just going to target the criminals, that they were just going to target the gang members. Well, you can't do mass deportations and do that at the same time, because there aren't enough criminals and gang members to mass deport. There are some, obviously, that can be swept up and removed from the country and deserve to be removed from the country. But the only way you can get to the level of millions upon millions of undocumented and mixed status people in this country is to just, without any kind of care in the world about human decency, just sweep people up off the streets, out of restaurants, and out of these kinds of jobs that you mentioned. They're going to people. They're not going after criminals if they're going after people's workplaces. They're not going after criminals if they're deporting whole families when the kid in the family is a U.S. citizen, but the parents aren't. That's not the same thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's really a situation where the rhetoric that we've been hearing for years and years and years is not going to match the reality of what they are capable of doing.
Yeah.
So when you run up against a roadblock, what do you do? And I think that's where we're seeing the Trump playbook, is that you escalate. You
Yes.
create
That's why.
you keep escalating. And, and when that doesn't work, you find another way to escalate, and you sort of move. He's very comfortable. And this is, in one sense, really one of his biggest political skills, is he is very comfortable living in chaos. Other people are
Yes.
uncomfortable, but he thrives in it. So he is
That's
going,
correct.
so he believes that he will come out of this situation better than his political opponents, because he will use it and use the chaos as a way to kind of collect more grist for whatever the next chapter is of
No,
this.
you're absolutely right, John. As a matter of fact, I once spoke with Ryan Priebus, who was Trump's first chief of staff, and I wrote about this at the time. He told me that Trump likes to be the master of the chaos or he likes to whip up chaos because he can then be the master of the chaos. He can be in the center of that storm, sort of controlling it, manipulating it, using it to his gain, and so on. And it's clear that's what he's doing here. But Judd Legum, I'm so glad we're able to do this finally. Thanks so
Yeah.
much for doing it. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All
It
right.
was a
Good to
pleasure.
see you. All
Okay.
right. It was
Thanks.
absolutely a pleasure. Thanks a lot. And we'll hope for the best and hope that things de-escalate if they can, if Trump will allow it out there in Southern California. I have so many friends out there. I just hate to think about what may be coming, what may be in store out there as Trump continues to try to light the match, try to set off a spark that will result in the kind of crisis that he is seeking, uh, so he can respond in a way that he's been dreaming about for many, many years. That's the thing that concerns me. And so, obviously, we need to get the word out. I just want to say once again, if anybody's watching this or listening to this, and they're involved in these protests and these demonstrations, I know that you know that I know that the right thing to do is to protest peacefully. Get your voices out there. There's no question about it. If there is something to protest about in this day and age and what is happening right now, this is it. It is absolutely worth demonstrating against what's been taking place since Donald Trump's been back in the White House. This heartless, cruel, inhumane mass deportation policy, which was sold with a lie that they were going after criminals and gang members, when, of course, all they really wanted to do was to make the United States less diverse. That has always been Donald Trump's goal. That has always been Stephen Miller's goal. They've gotten a second chance to try to make that happen, and that's what they're trying to do this time around. And that brings me to just one final thing I wanted to say, and I saw a couple people ask whether I was going to talk about it. Let me just preface this by saying I don't typically like, as much as people talk about me, and of course, I was all over Fox last week, and thank you, Fox, for doing that. It's not really my cup of tea to want to talk about my friends in the press, talk about my colleagues in the press. Sometimes I feel like that puts more stress and just pressure on people who are going through stuff when they get caught up in, some of the things that can happen when you cover Donald Trump in a tough way. When you cover Donald Trump in a tough way, make no mistake, they will come after you. The White House will come after you. His minions will come after you on Fox and in conservative media. People like Caroline Levitt and Kayleigh McEnany and, some of these people who are going to regret what they're doing and saying later on in life, they will come after you. There's no question about it. They'll call you all kinds of names and so on. So the last thing I want to do is get involved in that kind of a fray, because sometimes I feel as though because I've been in the middle of this, I understand what it's like. I didn't like it when I was getting criticized for my coverage of Donald Trump, not so much by the conservative, ass whites on the far right. I don't care about those guys. But, I did care from time to time when some of my friends in the press would weigh in. And, of course, you want your friends to like and respect your work and so on. Anyway, having said all of that preface there, I am concerned about what has taken place over at ABC. I respect the hell out of a lot of the people over there at ABC. I do think the way that they settled that lawsuit that was aimed at George Stephanopoulos was wrong. I don't think they should have done that. I think it incentivized what Trump has been doing now in terms of going after the press. And they're doing it yet again by throwing Terry Moran under the bus. Terry, over the weekend, and I don't know Terry that well. He and I have just worked around each other over the years. I respect him as a journalist. He's a very good reporter. Terry, over the weekend, put out a tweet, which he later deleted, that basically said that Stephen Miller, one of Trump's top aides, is basically all about hate. And as somebody who has been in Stephen Miller's crosshairs, as somebody who's gone toe-to-toe with Stephen Miller, I did it back in August of 2017 in the White House briefing room when he and I went round and round over the meaning of the Statue of Liberty, when he tried to whitewash the meaning of the Statue of Liberty with white supremacist talking points. That was when I learned what Stephen Miller was all about. They would swear up and down inside the White House that Stephen was not all about that. But he came after me with language that, as it turned out, was very incendiary. He was saying that I had a cosmopolitan bias. These are things that white supremacist websites were using to go after their targets back in the day. Kind of convenient there that Stephen Miller would use that same kind of language. Anyway, the fact that he went after me in that fashion, the fact that he has been Trump's main propagandist on the issue of immigration and demonizing immigrants ever since Trump started running for the White House, accusing migrants of being part of an invasion in this country and so on. I mean, that kind of language comes from somebody who hates, somebody who has hate in their heart. And I have to say, when I saw Terry Moran's tweet over the weekend, and again, I don't mean to insert myself into this situation, but people want to know what I think. I think Terry hit the nail on the head. I think Terry was stating things exactly right. And maybe he felt because he was working for a big news organization that he had to take that tweet down, or perhaps they told him to take it down. I don't know what the circumstances are. But what he was saying in that tweet was true. I believe Stephen Miller, based on my experience covering him, has hate in his heart. I think it's what drives him. I think it's what drives his aggressive posture inside the White House when he lashes out at officials inside the administration that their mass deportation numbers are not high enough. I don't like to think that about another human being, and there aren't many human beings in the world that I think that about. But I do believe that at the end of the day, in the final analysis, Stephen Miller, you have hate in your heart. Donald Trump, you have hate in your heart. And it is one of the more unfortunate things about who you are. As many unfortunate things as there are, it is perhaps the most unfortunate thing about who you are. When you have hate in your heart, you have no business being in charge of this country. You have no business being the commander-in-chief of this country. You have no business being the president of the United States of this country. If you have hate in your heart. If you have hate in your heart, there are lots of other things you can do with your free time. You can have a TV show on conservative media. There are lots of people with hate in their heart who have TV shows on conservative media. But at the end of the day, what Terry Moran said was true. And that's what people in the press should be doing right now. Without worrying about the consequences, without fear or favor, they should be telling you, the American people, the truth, what's at the heart of the matter. And what we're seeing driving the situation to the brink in Los Angeles tonight is hate. Hate in the hearts of some of the people who run this country. And until those individuals do some self-examination, which I don't think is ever going to come, I think we know the track record here, it's not going to come, we're going to be on the precipice of bad things from now until this particular occupant of the Oval Office leaves the scene. And I don't say 2028 or January of 2029 when I say when he leaves the scene, if indeed that happens at the end of this term. It's not something I want to talk about on a Monday night. It's not something that I want folks who are coming home from work thinking about as they're cracking open a beer or getting dinner on the stove. But it is the reality of the situation. And the folks who are watching this now, people who are watching this later, need to understand, and the people in the White House need to understand, you cannot crush the truth in America. And if you cannot crush the truth in America, you cannot crush the people. You cannot crush all of the people who want to hear the truth in America. And if you cannot crush all of the people who want to hear the truth in America, you cannot crush all of the people who want to tell the truth in America. My thanks to Michael Cohen. My thanks to Judd Legum. Really appreciate all of you watching. Still reporting from Washington. I'm Jim Acosta. Have a good evening.